So thank you very much, Peter, for a wonderful introduction, and also thank you to the John Innes Centre for the invitation. We're absolutely delighted to be able to attend and speak today. So, as Peter was suggesting, the talk that we're going to give today comes from a shared project that John and I are involved in, which is Constructing Scientific Communities, Citizen Science in the 19th and the 21st Centuries. Now, this originates, I suppose, going back a previous project I did, which was looking at the representation of science in periodicals in the 19th century. So this is a bit of an explanation of how someone who studies English literature is here. But it was general periodicals, but looking at the ways in which people were thinking about science. But from that, I started thinking about the thousands of periodicals that were published in the 19th century to do with natural history and other forms of science, and how so many of these were produced by small natural history groups that very rarely get any mention in the larger telling of the story of the development of science. And what I'm interested in is retelling that story, bringing in the large galaxy of characters that were involved in the making of science in the 19th century. And the link to citizen science is that I was thinking about all this, and then what we now call citizen science started to hit the headlines. This was, well, primarily for me, it was the project called Zooniverse, which is the world's largest online platform of citizen science, where anybody can go on and actually participate in science. And Zooniverse are involved in our project. And I should say that the project is based at Oxford and Leicester, but in collaboration with the Natural History Museum in London, as well as the Royal Society in London and the Royal College of Surgeons. And it's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. One of our partners is also Zooniverse, which is based at Oxford. So this is their homepage, and it says people-powered research. The Zooniverse provides opportunities for people around the world to contribute to real discoveries in fields ranging from astronomy to zoology. Welcome to the world's largest platform for collaborative volunteer research. So there are many different understandings of what citizen science means, but it tends now to be used primarily for these very large internet-based studies where you can go on and take one of the pages of Zooniverse's projects. You can see that they've moved into humanities now, so you can annotate in Shakespeare's world. You can look at the behaviour of whales, or if you're feeling really idle, you can go and count penguins. So a lot of people do this if they're feeling sort of stressed out. Endless penguins, and all you have to do is count them. Other of the projects are far more demanding. And one of the wonderful things about the Zooniverse project is the way in which it has launched many, many people who knew nothing about the areas in which they were looking at. Then they start to self-educate, particularly in astronomy. So there have been magnificent stories who people who knew nothing about astronomy went on just to see what it's all about, and then end up. There was one tale of a woman in Holland who actually, a week in on Galaxy Zoo, discovered a completely new phenomenon. So quite extraordinary possibilities. But to talk now about citizen science in the past, and also Norwich. As you are probably aware, Norwich itself and Norfolk has a wonderful lineage with regards to the development of botany. Particularly James Edward Smith, who was, you probably are aware, the founder of the Linnaean Society, and he was the holder of the Linnaean collections, which he bought when Linnaeus died. And indeed, these collections were to be visited for many years in Surrey Street in the centre of Norwich before they were transferred to the Linnaean Society in London. Also, one of his protégés was William Jackson Hooker, who became the first full-time director of Kew from 1841 and built it up to almost to what it is now. And he's succeeded by his even more famous son, Joseph. Now, Smith, I think, is a very fascinating character. in part because he too was very concerned with acknowledging the work of working class or lower class botanists in the area. So in the Transactions of the Linnaean Society for 1804, he has an article describing all the working class botanists that he was indebted to in Norwich. So here he talks about Mr. Wilson, the tailor, who'd made frequent journeys to London around 1735 to 40, and part of his herbarium, very scientifically named, has fallen into my hands. So a sense that his own career was dependent upon these figures in Norwich, who normally get no acknowledgement at all. And previously, in 1793, someone had published details about how they'd been the first to grow the Lycodium silago. I have to be very careful when I'm speaking in front of botanists. But Smith adds a little note at the end to say, but no, actually, there was a journeyman weaver in Norwich, Joseph Fox, who was the first to do this, as far as I know, that he showed me in 1779 how he'd raised it in his own garden. He says, this humble observer, whose name has not yet appeared in any book, is the original discoverer of many rare plants in the county of Norfolk, and it is with pleasure I commemorate his former assistance to myself. Once you get into the 19th century, sort of mid-19th century onwards, and professional science is developing, there are all sorts of stories of scientists who never acknowledge who actually produced the specimens for them, particularly in paleontology. So these armies of people who've been helping in science but get no acknowledgement. Interestingly, Smith also notes that there was a society for natural history in Norwich in the late 18th century. Normally when people talk about the growth of natural history societies, we date them from the 1830s, but clearly there was a whole community operating and a society in Norwich in the late 18th century. So again, Norwich in front of the field. But also surprisingly, they didn't actually set up a journal and a proper society with all its apparatus until 1869, which was quite late. So here's the frontispiece from their first transactions of the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society. And I'm delighted to see that the society is still very active and has all the transactions on their website, should you be interested. One of the interesting things about this society is what their rules, their objects were. First one, the practical study of natural science. Yes, one would expect that. But then it starts talking about the protection by its influence with landowners and others of indigenous species requiring protection. And then keeps going on about how we've got to stop all this destruction going on. So virtually all, so the next one, so number 3, discouragement of the practice of destroying the rarest species, not merely of birds, but also exterminating rare plants. And similarly to the next one, and then publication of papers, and then a friendly society recording and discussing and having field excursions. Normally, that last is the one that comes first. So it's a fascinating society. One of the reasons I think it's so focused on extermination is this is just post a bill that was in Parliament about the Seabirds Preservation Bill, where people were very, very worried about the destruction of seabirds. And Norfolk and Norwich were very involved in getting that bill passed. But also, very interestingly, they're concerned about plants. And this is in part because of the success of the whole movement of botany and botanizing and people going out into the countryside. So suddenly it's reversed, and now they're trying to stop this extermination. So fascinating the way in which Norfolk was taking the lead. In the transactions, the opening presidential address was from a Reverend Joseph Crompton. And he notes how they were working both with the geological and the meteorological societies which were operating in the area. But interestingly, he has very sharp words for poor Lord Kimperley, who's just joined the society, who says he hopes that he will now have words with all the landowners locally and make sure that they too stop all this progress of extermination. And there's also in this first issue an account from a Mr. Southwell, who was looking at the extermination of birds. But interestingly, he's not just looking in the present time, he actually goes back to records from 1519 and follows through. So the habit we have now of trying to go back and find historical records, they were doing in the late 19th century. And they also talk about the hope for cleaner rivers so that fish can return. So again, you think, has anything changed? But they were, in the 19th century, very, very concerned about protecting the environment. Now, I want to turn to various networks of what I would see as a form of citizen science in the 19th century. And my first example is G.J. Symonds, wonderful bearded patriarch here, who set up something called the British Rainfall Network. He started in 1860 just with a handful of observers, and then created an extraordinary network right across Britain of people who measured every day the fall of the rain. And then he brought all these together and published an annual an account. So this is his 1880 one, whereas you can see here it says he has more than 2,000 stations across Britain and Ireland. And by the time he died, and he did it right up until 1900 when he died, he had 3,400 stations where people were going out in all weathers. I'll show you some pictures. So this is a simple setup in a home. But this, if you really wanted to get into meteorology and measurement, here is what you could do. Some very, very advanced forms of measuring all sorts of meteorological phenomena here. And Symonds was utterly dedicated to this. He advertised in all the newspapers across Britain. One point he was handwriting to 1,400 newspapers to get observers involved. He travelled the length and breadth of Britain to make sure that people had got their equipment in the right place, etc., and knew how to use it. And he insists also that anybody can do it, whatever age or sex. So very advanced he was. And he also published a monthly magazine where he got people involved in debates, and also he tended to tell them off if they failed to go out when it was a snowstorm, or they assumed on a hot day that there'd be no rain. You can't do that. You have to measure every day. But he has a wonderful passage I'd like to show you from one of his reports, where he talks about the fact that I'm sometimes myself astonished at the magnitude of this amateur organisation, without either state aid, magnificent title, managing council or pecuniary resources, except the voluntary contributions of the staff. And the staff who rarely see one another, let alone their chief, who, as you can see, in all these places where the stations are. And it says, who include nearly every social grade, from peer to peasant. Not language we use now, but we know what he means. And yet, with few exceptions, work with regularity and heartiness, which is beyond praise. Why do they do it? Minor motives may have some influence, but I believe that the leading sentiment which binds together British rainfall observers is the consciousness that they are helping gradually to store up a mass of information which is and will yearly become increasingly valuable to the nation at large, in relation alike to agriculture, sanitation, and the proper appropriation of the water supply of the British Isles. And interestingly, in studies of citizen science nowadays, because economists are quite puzzled, why do people give up their time when they're not being rewarded? Why do they do it? And the answer always comes back, because they want to contribute to the development of science. And this is what was happening in the 19th century. And in fact, Symonds, the meteorological office, tried to take them over and make them a department of government. And he said, absolutely not. I'm not having this. These are my volunteers. They are doing it for love. bind them with red tape and the whole thing will fizzle, and he absolutely refused. Though when he died, unfortunately, they did get taken over. But all the reports are on the Meteorological Office website, and are still very, very important for climate change. So if you want to follow them, you can go back and visit them. But notice at the end how he's talking about agriculture, sanitation, and water supply. So many areas that he saw as interlinked, and indeed the Victorians did, but often we separate when we're thinking about the history of the time. And also, he was responsible for a book on vegetable technology, which was basically, it says, a bibliography of economic botany. So he was also a huge collector of books on botany and the economic uses and in the relation to agriculture. So for him, rainfall was absolutely linked up to the whole development of agriculture. So I turn to my next example now, which is Eleanor Ormerod. She set, as you can see, she's here being given a very unusual honorary degree from Edinburgh at the end of the 19th century. She started life as a meteorological observer, I think absolutely copying Symonds. She was well born, family quite scientifically interested, but she really got started in her work when she saw an advert in the Gardener's Chronicle of 1868 asking people to send in specimens of every abnormality or remarkable vegetable production due to insects which may come under their observation. And this is from the British Horticultural Society. Imagine asking people to send to your home address whatever sort of odd vegetables they found. But this set her off on basically her life's work, which was to study injurious insects. And she, like Symonds, got people to write to her and send in all their observations about how insects were destroying crops. And she became a world leader and recognized. She consulted for governments across the world and indeed in Britain on all the forms of pests. But interestingly, she started off on her father's estate by getting all the school children to bring in their specimens and then built up. And she did a lot of work with fruit growers and other agricultural producers in Britain. So I turn now to a citizen science project that we ourselves have done. This is Science Gossip, and what it's doing is asking volunteers to go online and classify illustrations in 19th century natural history periodicals so that we can understand how people were reading and learning about natural history at that point. It's called Science Gossip because of the wonderful periodical called Science Gossip for lovers of nature, which ran the mid-19th century onwards. So many of these periodicals nobody has written about, but they're absolute treasure troves. So if you'd like to go on Science Gossip, I very much recommend it. It has this increasing numbers of participants, because once people become hooked, because you not only look at the page that you're classifying, but you can read around, and there's such fun material to find. So these are some of the periodicals we've used. I should say one of the wonders of them also is that you get people who have nothing to do with scientific botany, but also Darwin, for example. He contributed to the Magazine of Natural History. He wrote in to Science Gossip to participate in a discussion about whether hedgehogs convey strawberries around on their prickles. And he also wrote into the Gardener's Chronicle to ask for breeders' observations on mouse-coloured ponies. So Darwin created his own form of citizen science network. You're probably aware he corresponded with 2,000 people, from cattle breeders, pigeon fanciers, plant growers, most of whom would never be seen in normal classifications as linked up with science. So just quickly, some of the wonders of these journals. So this is a beautiful one, I think, of dragonflies from Science Gossip. The participants can do many things participating. One, they can create their own series of images for their own research or for their pleasure. This is someone who took illuminated letters from all of the magazines to create an alphabet. On the site, they can post interesting things they found. And someone posted vegetable sheep. And I thought, well, this is just being playful. And then I looked and saw that actually it's an article from somebody in Kew entitled The Vegetable Sheep of New Zealand. So it's quite fun material, I think. You can also look at old adverts. Endlessly fascinating, I think, should you be interested in the history of horticulture and other forms. Another thing that has been occurring is that the participants are actually setting up their own research projects. So here, one of the participants said, have you noticed there's quite a few female illustrators here? And they've set up a whole sort of observation network so that they can start to record all the women who are providing wonderful illustrations. And again, nobody ever speaks about them. So it's fascinating ongoing material. But I end with a slide which is from the Wiltshire Archaeological and Natural History magazine. And I end with it because one of the participants in Sans Gossip found it and posted it on our talk function and says, look, isn't this what we're doing? So, to read it, it needs no oracle to tell you that many are better than one when hard work is to be done. The best way is to try what union of industry and union of accomplishments may do, to collect the scattered elements of strength and to set several to work instead of one. That is what I believe to be the principle and object of the present society. So they really recognise in reading these 19th century periodicals that what they were reading about was precisely what they wanted to do, to have the one combined into the many and to contribute to science. And with that, I'll hand over to John.
Okay. Thank you, Sally, and good evening, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight. So I'm going to be following on from Sally, concentrating, it's working, there we go, a little more on scientific communities in the present century. So I'll start by looking at continuity and change and finish by introducing a project we developed through constructing scientific communities which really look to build on this phenomenal legacy of 19th century natural history that Sally introduced by working with two of the key communities we have now when it comes to citizen science, if you like, the amateur expert natural history community and the online citizen science community, the Zooniverse crowd. So I think when we look at amateur natural history networks in the 21st century, it's actually very much a story of continuity. So many of the groups that exist in the 19th century in particular are still present today. We have this great tradition of natural history societies focused on local areas or particular species groups across the whole of the UK. And there are over 450 of these societies present within England alone. And I think the motivations that their members have for joining these groups are actually also pretty similar to the 19th century. So the aesthetic appreciation of nature, the wonder of discovering and identifying wildlife, reputation with your peers, wanting to be known as a scientist and a naturalist who's one of the experts to go to in the local area, and of course scientific study, and conversing with people with similar interests. And actually a lot of these groups, particularly the local natural history societies like some of those around Norwich, actually interact with each other in pretty similar ways now to the 19th century. Meetings focused on expert talks, field natural history visits, and newsletters, local atlases of the flora every decade or so as well. So there's great continuity there. We're also getting a new form of group joining at the same time who don't actually meet face-to-face or in the field doing natural history that much at all, but they interact a huge amount over social media, things like Facebook. They'll be sharing all the wildlife they've gone out and found, even if not looking together. But I think one of the areas where the amateur expert natural history groups have changed perhaps most markedly since the 19th century is very much built on the idea that was certainly around in the 19th century of specialist species groups. So from the kind of 1980s, 1950s to 1980s onwards perhaps, and again in the last decade, we're seeing more and more national recording schemes formed. And these are voluntary networks, but very much based on people interested in exploring a particular taxonomic group. So there's a few on the list here from the Biological Record Centre website, which is a fantastic research group that does a lot to support these networks. And these are the botanical and fungi groups, for example. And these members of these groups, and I'm one, I record slugs, in case anyone's interested in slugs. More people should be recording slugs. Spend an awful lot of their time going outdoors and making things called biological records. So identifying wildlife, making a note of what was found, when, where, and by whom. So biological record, biological observation. It's estimated that over 70,000 people spend their spare time doing this every year. And one more recent estimate is that this equates to over 750,000 volunteer hours just making notes of a wildlife. I think it's largely because of this unpaid activity, these networks of naturalists with a shared goal in mind, that we know so much about the UK's wildlife. We know that we have over 71,000 species of plants and animals and fungi, largely because people are going out there in any weather, it has to be said, recording what they find. And above all, sharing that with other people. The information we have there, the data on what we have, is absolutely fundamental to any study we make in the UK around conservation biology, around looking at species change through time, for example, species trends, and tracking the spread of new species that come into the UK and may or may not expand, may or may not harm the taxa we've already got. That's all based on biological records. And I did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation through a website where these data are shared called the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, just before I came here. And by my reckoning, there's over 180 million of these observations shared for free for anyone to use for scientific purposes, which goes back to what Sally was saying, actually. It's a whole shared endeavour. I wanted to help with the bigger picture. So 180 million is a big number to imagine. It's quite hard to imagine. So what I've done here is I've gone onto the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, and I've said, tell me which observations we've got of wildlife within 10-kilometre radius of this lecture theatre. So we're the red balloon, I guess, in the middle there, and 10-kilometre circle around us. And as I have to admit, I thought we might get 300,000 or 400,000 observations. So far wrong with that one. So over 1.16 million observations of wildlife been shared within 10 kilometres of where we are now. And a lot of these are current observations over the last 20 or 30 years, but there's some historical data there as well. So we know there are over, from this, the best part of 7,000 species within 10k of where we live, or at least they've been recorded recently. So that means that for the more common species, like the blue tit here, you can see dots all over the map. That's where the observations have come from. That we can get a very clear idea for the more common species exactly where they're living, and we can start to look at trends through time, so how populations are changing. But we can also do some fairly fun things, like track the less usual species in Norwich, at least. Very normal in London. So I see these little fellas every day on the way to work, sometimes see them going past the office. It's the ring-necked parakeet, or rosy-ringed parakeet. 50 to 80,000 breeding pairs in London, and they're gradually moving north and west. And from the data that have been shared, and there might not be all the data that have been shared, we know at least 8 have made it as far as Norwich. A day trip to seaside kind of trip or something like that. That's 2 years out of date, so maybe they're established here, and someone in the room would know more than me. So we have this great tradition of amateur expert natural history, and I think that's something we should really, really value and appreciate. No other country has this legacy of interest in the UK's wildlife, and because of that, the data on the UK's wildlife that we do. But we're also in the middle of a citizen science revolution, which Sandy is already... Sally is my colleague. Sorry, I'll start again. I'm writing a grant with someone called Sally at the moment. That's where that came from. I do apologise. So we've already explored a little bit about the current citizen science revolution. So this is a very different form of collaborative science to the amateur expert naturalists we have out there. So this is a Google map which shows how the search term within the Google search engine has been looked at since 2008. And it shows its rise towards 2018 on the right-hand side, to where we are now, the peak of now. If Google had the data back to 2000, we'd see that was a 0 point. So people weren't searching really for citizen science before 2000 as a term. It's now become a phenomenon. It's got its own entry in the Oxford English Dictionary, since 2014, so you know a new subject's made it when you get in there. And this is a very different form of science. These tend to be projects that are developed by academic institutions, originally scientific institutions, but we've seen from Sally's slides earlier, humanities as well. And these are projects where academics have a specific research question in mind, and they're asking large public audiences who may or may not be trained in sciences, for example, may or may not have taken part in this kind of project before, to lend their minds and their expertise, their eyes quite often, to a shared endeavour, to gather scientific data, and less frequently to help analyse and publish scientific data. And it's been driven by a wide range of factors, I think. The kind of science questions we're looking at now, for example, if we're looking at understanding climate change, we need a huge amount of data gathered or analysed. There's a big groundswell of support within very broad public audiences. People enjoy doing this. We've seen this earlier with Zooniverse. People are willing to spend their times in this way. I think because of that, we're developing these collaborative networks that are quite different to the naturalist sector. So I thought I'd give a couple of examples of projects we run at the museum. So these are recent or current projects, just to give a flavour of the kinds of projects that are out there you can take part in, for those of you who might be new to citizen science. So up in the top left, we've got people in a rock pool. So one of our programmes is called the Big Seaweed Search. We're asking people to head outdoors when they're on the beach on holiday or in their local area, and do something as simple as rock pooling, identifying the seaweeds they can find, sharing those data with us so we can map seaweeds around the UK. The UK is a global hotspot for seaweed, seaweed diversity. By doing something as simple as a 15-minute survey, you can be part of a bigger project looking at how environmental change, so ocean acidification, the spread of invasive species, for example, you can be in a project that's looking at how that's affecting our seaweeds. And that's open to anyone. We tend to work with family groups in that who won't necessarily have tried to identify seaweeds before, and you can get really good quality data still. We have some people with muddy hands, which I think you can just about see there. They've been digging for earthworms for science. So it's a project called Earthworm Watch, which is working primarily with school groups, actually, schools and families, and allotment holders, for example. Asking people to dig some experimental pits, find the worms they can see in there, identify them for us. And this gives us an idea on earthworm diversity. It gives us an idea on carbon storage within the soil, a big issue now we have climate warming. And it was also encouraged to run experiments looking at if you change the soil treatment, which could be composting to you and I, how does that affect the earthworm diversity, for example, and does it store more carbon in the soil? And I guess one other field example up in the top right is a project we're running with schools called Microverse, which is really about biodiversity discovery. It's very much aimed at schools. It's asking schools to get out in the field but do DNA science, the kind of thing they can't do in a classroom normally, the kind of thing you read from a textbook. Next generation DNA science, so they're swabbing their school building, sending it back to us, and through video links they can see us analysing the data in the labs and talking about their results. And we're finding anywhere up to 2,000 species living on school walls in a block about so big, about 20 centimetres square. And this is undiscovered biodiversity that has an impact on the building, it has an impact on our health in a positive way as well as a negative way. And it's a real new area that students don't normally get the chance to get involved in until they're at least at a degree level. So citizen science can really do this. And of course we've got the online projects as well, which I'll come back to later. So just to stress really that these new forms of citizen science are very research directed, combine public education with different sectors of society, with genuine research science. And from the perspective of a research scientist, it's really opening up the kind of science we can do and the science engagement we can do, going back to the earlier introductions. So the field of citizen science, in a very public sense, has evolved incredibly rapidly over the last 10 years, and it's really exciting to be involved in it. Now starting to stabilise a little bit, but as with many new fields, it's not always smooth running. So my perspective, and I'm a regular biological recorder, from my perspective as a biological recorder, I tend not to think of myself as a citizen science when I'm out observing wildlife. I'm a naturalist or I'm a recorder. When I'm involved in a citizen science project with someone else, helping generate data, for example, then I'm a citizen scientist, and I'm cool with that. But we do get some conflicts with the more traditional sector in some cases around whether or not everyone's a citizen scientist who volunteers in science. And I think that's a really fair point. So this is a letter within an eminent British wildlife magazine, eminent naturalist magazine in the UK. It's written by a biological recorder. I don't know if you can read it, but the top starts with, I was quite affronted recently to learn that I was a citizen scientist. Because I'm not, I'm a recorder. And that's a fair point. I would agree with that. We need to be careful a little bit with terminology, because we're all different projects. I agree less with some of the statements that are in the speech bubbles, but it does highlight there's still concern around. I've spent a long time training, either in professional scientific fields or as a naturalist identifying species. Are you really going to tell me that everyone can go out there with minimal instruction and gather information in the way that I can, accurate scientific data? So there is this conflict as well. I think we're gradually starting to bottom this out, and actually there's some great projects where, without any training at all, do very high-level science. I think we're all scientists at heart in many ways. Okay, so that's whistled through a little bit of the 21st century citizen science sector. I just wanted to finish with the last 10 or 12 minutes or so, just introducing a project called Orchid Observers. And this is a project we developed through Constructing Scientific Communities programme that really tried to bring together the incredible legacy of the 19th century naturalists, specifically the museum specimens they helped create. 19th century naturalists loved collecting, as we do now. A lot of this material has found its way back to big museums like the Natural History Museum. It's like a form of a biological record, because the information on the labels tells you what was found where, and the specimen tells you what it was, and of course when. So looking at these historical data sets and looking at how we can develop a joint project with the Botanical Recording Community, Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and the online Zooniverse community, so field naturalists and people that tend to spend their time on a computer in the comfort of their home. And the project we came up with was looking at how climate change is affecting the UK's plants, specifically orchids. I think this is a great example of the kinds of questions we can ask now in modern citizen science. I mentioned it a little earlier, but if we really want to understand change and predict future change with our wildlife, for example, in response to changing climate, we need very large data sets. We need to look back in time to see where species were found before they were changing, through the climate change period, and ideally going forward as well. We need to look at large geographical areas as well. It's no good looking at climate change just in your garden. You need to look at how this is happening across the whole of the UK in our case. So we looked at whether we could combine this historical information with modern approaches. Okay, so we picked orchids for a number of reasons. They're beautiful. And that's not a flippant comment, they are beautiful. Because they're beautiful, there's a public interest in them. People might want to get involved in these kinds of projects. But there's also a tremendous history of the amateur expert naturalists really being passionate about orchids. That means we can have great historical records and great contemporary records as well. So people just love going out and finding them. They're also a species group that's quite diverse in the UK, so 56 species. We actually looked at 29 of these species. It gives us an idea of how, for a particular species group, there's variation between taxa. Do they all respond the same? Do they respond differently to climate? And they're also of ecological and conservation significance. So we know that within the UK, some orchids are doing incredibly well. Others have never quite recovered from 19th century overcollection, actually. And others seem to be suffering bad effects through either habitat change or climate. And we know that some species are responding to climate already. So it's a good chance to try this methodology. So what we asked to do was there were 3 parts of the project. We asked people to head outdoors, so the botanical recording community, biological recorders, across the whole of the UK, to go outside and look for orchids and take a photo. But we also invited anyone who wanted to do this. So it was very much a wider public project, not just aimed at naturalists. Find the orchids using this guide, and I've got around 10 copies of the guide that anyone can take home with them afterwards if anyone wants an orchid publication. Upload this to the website, where the online crowd will help to identify them and to detect the flowering stage in these orchids, because the project we're looking at is really focusing on how is climate affecting the flowering times of our orchids as a proxy for how it's affecting them in different ways as well, and a starting point. The people online could have been from the Zooniverse community, and we know from surveys we've run with them aren't really botanists. They're interested in science, but they're not specialists in botany. Or they could be field naturalists who came online to look at these. The other activity online was to help us extract information from the historical specimens, so digital images of the specimens with their labels, specimen labels, and we invited people to help us extract the who, what, where, when information, so we know when they were found, but also to look at them and try and find the flowering stage of those specimens. Now, That's what they look like in the field, colourful, beautiful. That's what they all look like on specimens, brown and squidged. Not the easiest thing to look at, more of a niche activity, but we've still got a lot of uptake. And as for the other Zooniverse projects, we encourage people to interact through the community online. Share questions about specimens they weren't sure about, identifications they weren't sure about, and to learn from each other and from us. And we kept them up to date regularly. So the project launched in 2015, 1 year's worth of field research. In keeping with most of the citizen science programs out there at the moment, using this modern approach, open to all kind of projects, we got a huge amount of media attention. I think that's one of the big changes in the last 10 years or so. Media outlets like the BBC are really excited about the possibility to involve more people in science. And it kind of worked. So we weren't too sure if this would work when we started. It was an experiment. Thankfully, it did work. Over 1,700 records of orchids across the UK for the 29 species we were looking at, all supported by beautiful photographs. It make a good art project as well. Something that did surprise us a little, though, is that over 200 of these were for new populations of orchids. Now, orchids in the UK, and some of you will be quite familiar with this, I'm sure, very well-studied group. But we're still finding new colonies that, and in completely new 10-kilometre squares, we're finding species that hadn't been found there before, or at least data that hadn't been shared from there before. And this is quite surprising. I think a lot of this is because we invited new people to take part. As biological recorders, we've got our favourite places to go to. I think new eyes were looking in new places, which to me really symbolises an awful lot of citizen science now. It's new eyes, looking in new places, and thinking in different ways. This actually included one observation of lady orchid, which wasn't one of the species we were looking at because it's conservation sensitive. It's known from a handful of localities in South England. It's now known from one more location, found by a dog walker. And in terms of getting the information out of historical records, we've got that too. So when you piece this together, it's enabled us to pull together a time series actually from around about 1830, 1840 to the present day of the peak flowering times of these 29 species of UK orchids. We actually only looked at the data from 1878 onwards in the end, because the climate data we were looking at got a little bit ropey earlier than that. So we tried to focus it as scientifically accurately as we could. And I won't go into the science too much today, but please ask me afterwards if you're interested. What we then did was model the relationships between these flowering times across the different data sets with 63 different climate variables, mostly relating to precipitation, cold days, frost days, and temperature, monthly temperature, for example. And I just wanted to give a quick indication of the kind of science you can do with this. And again, it's just a quick whistle-stop tour. So for the green-winged orchid, my favourite orchid, it has to be said, one of our earliest flowering species, found in grasslands, in a variety of grassland habitats in the UK, tends to flower mostly during May, but, well, this year, mostly during May. It's a cold year this year. The species that's vulnerable primarily due to habitat change rather than climate, we think. And you can see the distribution at the bottom. The red dots are recent records, the paler the dots, the older the record. But what we can do for this species, we can start to draw, we can pull together like a history, if you like, of its peak flowering times, going back to 1878 on the left, 2016 on the right. So the dashed line represents May the 15th. So when the line's above that, it flowered later than May the 15th, below that flowered earlier. So you can have a look and you can see that, yeah, flowering times vary each year, and we see this, obviously, as gardeners, as naturalists anyway. We know things flower differently depending on how warm the spring was in particular. But you can also analyse this using a few different modelling techniques. And you can look at, okay, it's changing, but is it changing because of a range of climate variables, no climate variables at all, something different, or one particular? And for this species, we can show that it's all to do with February, March and April temperature, which again makes sense ecologically. It's reassuring in many ways. So we can start to say that actually since 1980, when climate change in the UK really started to kick in terms of temperature, it flowers, the data from there show that it flowers just between 6 and 7 days earlier for every 1 Celsius rise in temperature during the late winter, early spring. So you can start to predict for future temperature rises how early flowering could get if the plant can cope with that. So that, I said before, that's quite common sense. It's backing up what we already see as naturalists and as gardeners. But what it does do with this kind of approach is it means we can pull out the variables with climate that actually play key significance in driving, in this case, when this plant flowers. And so what I've done here is I've just taken the top graph is February to April temperature, mean temperature, And I've just mapped that above the peak flowering date, the median flowering date. And they track pretty closely. So what you can see is really that flowering time is tracking temperature in this case for this species. You can also see that the recent changes, which are linked into climate, are actually part of a longer term trend. It's the plant is behaving as it did before this current period of climate change. It's just what it does, which is really helpful when it comes to predicting future change. So I was going to very briefly skim over another species, and this is a species that we know is doing incredibly well because of climate already. So this is a bee orchid. It's a beautiful species. It's pollinated by a bee species on the continent. It's very much a Mediterranean species. In the UK, that bee species isn't here, and it self-pollinates instead. So it still looks the part, but it's not relying on bees. Grassland species again. Flowers a bit later, tend to be during June to late July. And we know that from the records from the biological recording schemes, the volunteer naturalist sector is spreading north and west quite rapidly. Presumably because of climate change is the thinking behind this. And the data really back that up. I won't go into the statistics again on this one, but it's a species that is incredibly responsive to any climate warming. It's got a very plastic flowering response. It can change flowering times very rapidly, quite clearly from the data, and it can change them quite significantly. I mean, it still flowers later in the UK than in the Mediterranean area, so we know it can flower earlier still. But it's the one that shows the strongest relationship to the climate variables we're looking at. So if you look at flowering time, lots of things can influence flowering time. Shading, local moisture level, for example, not just temperature. But for this species and the data sets we've got anyway, around about 90 to 92% of the variation is explained purely by temperature. And that's useful for us going forward. So, conscious of time, but very briefly, I think through these long-term data sets collected through different naturalist groups and contemporary citizen scientists online, we can look at how species respond to different factors, in this case climate. It's only because of these data that we could see that for the UK's orchids, the species we looked at, they all respond differently. There aren't any nice, neat trends saying grassland species respond in this way, woodland species in this way. It doesn't seem to be about phylogenetic relatedness. So closely related orchids don't respond in the same way. They all respond independently, which when we try to scale this up to look at how ecosystems might respond, it's that note of caution. It points us in the direction of the kind of analysis we need to do. And it also shows, actually, the response is marked since climate change really kicked in the 1980s in the UK. We are starting to see a real change. Just one part of the conservation picture. I don't want to oversell what we were doing. I mean, it's a great test case, but it's just one element of how plants and animals respond. But it gives us something to work from going forward. And I think it really does show the value of the data we have in this history in the UK. So I'll probably leave it there, I think. So there's plenty of time for questions, but I just really want to extend very warm thanks, and I'm sure some of you in the room are amateur expert naturalists as well, but to all the dedicated naturalists over the past 2 or 3 centuries who have helped compile the expertise we have in the UK and the data that's really allowing us to, in many ways, lead the world with a lot of the conservation science we do, because we've got those baseline data sets we can work from. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sally and John, for 2 brilliantly complimentary talks. We've got time for some questions, and Sally's joining John on the stage. If you have a question, can you wait until the microphone arrives and then deliver it? So, is there one at the back?
Yes, my near neighbour who had a lawn replaced about 3 years ago, last year we identified a bee orchid growing, and he's moved it, and it looks to a safer place, and it looks as though it's about to flower again this year. But is there a point, local point, that he should report that to, or would it help if it was recorded somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, every piece of data is valuable. You can do the analysis when you've got lots of data, but you need to know these things. So there will be a local biological recorder. So I'd recommend going to, if it's someone that's happy using a website to enter data, you can go to a website called iRecord. It's the letter I record. And you can upload any information of something you found through that one website, and that will go to the relevant local expert. So if someone that's web savvy, I'd go iRecord.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe I can ask a question, and I don't want to sound like a frosty old scientist, but actually as scientists we're governed. I mean, this has nothing to do with expertise or anything. There is a governance over science in terms of ethics and controls over things like misidentification and that sort of thing. And I can see with your ORCID project how clearly through photographic evidence you can have those controls. But what about other types of citizen science where you're asking maybe for observations which are not based on photographic evidence that can independently be checked? How do you rule out misidentification and that sort of thing?
Should I answer this?
Yeah.
Interestingly, because with the Zooniverse platform, they have multiple people doing the same identification. So, and it then sort of averages out, and they have shown that in most areas, the public are more accurate than the expert scientist.
Okay, I'll quickly move on to another question.
Yeah, I think John wants to respond to that.
So a quick follow-on for that one. You're quite right. Data quality is absolutely central to what we do. Whether you're a citizen scientist or a professional scientist, data quality is important. And just to follow up on the Zooniverse, so we looked at 5 people looking at every photo, and we checked this ourselves to see if it worked. And a consensus of 5 people for over half the species got 100% accurate with the ID, just by matching a photo, which shouldn't really work, but it does. So it is quite possible. It's called the wisdom of the crowd by the people who study this kind of thing, which doesn't sound quite right to me, but it's actually true.
Great. Any more questions? Yep, there's one up here.
Thanks. Many years ago, I was working in agriculture. I was on a farm which was on an old airfield, and one part of this field was uncultivated, but it was absolutely stuffed full of bee orchids. And this was many years ago. Subsequently, about 7 or 8 years after that, the farmer decided to drain and try and use that field. Now, what do you do in a situation like that? Are you allowed to move orchids? Can they be moved easily, or should you say, look, Mr. Farmer, you shouldn't be doing this?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. So there's a botanical code which forbids collecting and removing the entire plant and the rootstock, and that's something that most naturalists obey. Now, when it's in that situation, I'm not sure if that holds or not. But if you go, well, it's a bit late now, I guess, but Botanical Society of Britain Island website can give advice on that kind of thing. I think if you move it within your own land, that's fine. So if in that situation, if there was somewhere else that could have been moved within the same land, probably okay. Landowners move things all the time. But there are controls around moving wild plants. But the controls are mostly focused on removing rather than replanting. So I don't 100% know that one.
Okay. More questions? What's this one up there?
Over the last few years, somebody mentioned bee orchids. They've been popping up in the middle of my lawn, which is a bit awkward. I mean, if I moved those, surely that would be okay. But, you know, is there anywhere that will tell you how to remove an orchid like that? I mean, how deep are their roots and this sort of thing?
Oh, okay. Are there any orchid experts in the room? No? Okay, in which case, go for it. So moving within your own land is fine. So it's about removal of wild plants. Within your land, there's a slightly different definition. So look, for bee orchids, they don't go down too far, actually. If you dig a decent enough scoop around it and plant it, I mean, they do well. I've seen them growing in flower beds, actually. They do well in grassland. So if you've got a grassier flower bed or a grassier edge where it's away from the mower, that's fine. In the Natural History Museum's garden, we've actually transplanted bee orchids in, and they've just been put straight into a piece of chalk grassland. But they're only a fairly small root bowl. So yeah, if you take a generous scoop,
Okay,
it should be
thank
okay.
you.
Shall we move away from orchids? Are there any questions on 19th century science? Oh, well, let's take a couple there, and then we'll maybe some on 19th century.
Sorry, it was just a point again on orchids,
Okay.
really to point out that internationally, of course, there is a marked decrease in habitat for the whole of the orchid family due to deforestation and a range of other factors. And I sense that what we've been talking about this evening is actually agricultural production vis-a-vis natural environmental and the airfield that was mentioned there is just a similar case. But coming back to your recording of British orchids, of course, one of the things that you haven't reflected on is the extent to which habitat of the British wild orchid population is diminishing or is actually fundamentally changing. And it would be quite interesting to know, but I doubt that your project could do it, how much land is impacted by agricultural improvement, housing developments, highways and all the rest of the stuff that we all know is going on.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. We know that for most of the UK orchids that are declining, the majority of those are declining because of habitat change, which could be a habitat management change, could be the habitat is dug up. I mean, it's a varied spectrum, that's for sure. Now, I know there are groups who are particularly interested in this, Hardy Orchid Society, Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. They have groups of people studying this, certainly. So I wouldn't speak for them, they're the real experts. But yeah, it's a very fair point.
Millie?
Hi, I'm afraid I have a non-orchid related question. So with the periodicals, how widely were those distributed and what was the accessibility to people who were poorer, per se?
They range, quite a few of them were very cheap indeed, designed so they could be bought by a working class reader. And one thing that the Natural History Societies did was they exchanged periodicals. Sometimes they almost set up the society in order to create the exchange of periodicals with other natural history groups. Interestingly, they did it not only in Britain, but also internationally as well. So it's fascinating to track the ways in which this operates. But many of them, they were created, they survived for 10 issues, died, or they got swallowed up, a bit like now. You start a periodical and then it gets taken over by something else and the title keeps changing. So it's very interesting the way in which they operate. So some would be just the local readers and then where they were sent out. But others, the entomological magazines, someone started, it was yearly and then they went monthly, and then someone realized that actually for insects, you need recordings not just monthly, it means nothing, you need weekly. And so they set up a weekly one, which was read right across the country. So they vary tremendously, but they're fascinating, I think.
Thank you.
So you said that gradually citizen science, credits to citizen scientists died out during the 19th century, or the tendency to give credit.
Yeah.
Do you have a hypothesis as to why that was?
Oh, yes. It's absolutely not merely a hypothesis. It was the creation of the notion of the professional scientist. It's the building of the universities. It's the competition to be the discoverer. And with that, yes, you get no, we do not want the amateurs in here. We are professional scientists.
So, but what's changed today then? Because we have a professional scientist who's happy to give credit to.
Well, yeah, this is the question that I wonder to what degree the online citizen science movement, by creating this wide-scale accessibility, has actually changed attitudes towards what is science. Mm-hmm. That is part of what we'd like to actually create through the project.
So, up there.
Birds now. Every year the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust does a big bird count, and I've often thought about joining this, but my problem is, though I know probably 80% of the birds in Britain by sight, the other 20%, which we often call LBJs or little brown jobs, I just can't tell. But is that a problem, or should I join the watch anyway and just say that I've seen some birds that I can't identify?
Yeah, so I don't know that project specifically. So is it asking for all birds you see, or just particular ones on a list?
No, it's any birds
Yeah, okay.
on a certain site, generally on the farm
Yeah.
scale.
I would say join and put through the observations you're confident with. And there's always a communication route to the people organising it as well. You could actually say, I'm a little bit worried about this. I'm not sure that I understand how to identify the little brown jobs, which to me are little brown jobs as well. And you usually get that feedback. But with most projects, you tend to get a training resource with it as well to support you to develop your skills. So if that isn't in that project, you might want to give them a nudge and say, what would be really helpful is if you gave us some identification tips or told us these are the birds particularly you want us to look for. It's me being cheeky, but I think that's what I do.
Yeah. So it's not a problem.
No, and I think,
scientifically.
sorry, no, I spoke over you. I think it's not a problem. And the beauty of these projects is the sheer volume of data as well. There'll be a scientist, okay, it doesn't have to be a professional scientist, it could be an amateur naturalist behind the scheme, but there'll be a scientist who will be looking at the data quality, removing outliers. They'll have maps of where these birds normally live, and they'll be checking if something unusual is spotted in that area. And then they'll probably follow up and say, are you sure it's one of these? So it's either really exciting or it's actually, no, I wasn't too sure. So there's always value in sharing these things. Yeah.
Thank
Time
you.
for one more question, I think. One at the very back.
Just commenting on your last question. Surely the revival of citizen science is entirely due to the internet, isn't it? Entirely due to data harvesting is a phrase we've all been used to over the past couple of weeks from Mr. Zuckerberg, but it must be entirely due to the internet.
It's digital technologies more broadly, I think. So it's all linked to the internet, of course, but mobile phones, great way to capture, if it's an outdoor wildlife project, great way to capture a photographic record. Social media, great way to keep in touch with people, great way to advertise your project so more people find out about it. But yeah, definitely digital technologies, I'd say.
But there's also, I think, government interest, because the ways in which scientists are now being called to account and to explain themselves to the public. And so that there's therefore interest in what they see as a way of drawing the public actually into science rather than merely being passive recipients. So that there are elements, but yes, the digital development is one of the leaders, I think.
And I think that goes back to an earlier question actually as well. The emphasis from funders and government for what's called science impact in different ways. So public involvement in your science, awareness of your science, public value of the science you do is actually encouraging people to look at the science they're doing slightly more ethically in some ways. And because of that, citing that your data are from citizen science sources is now something that's kind of commonly accepted as good practice. We're still getting far more papers published based on citizen science data that don't mention they are, but we're starting to see more and more papers coming out there now that are up front and say, yeah, but it's citizen science-derived data. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So before we wrap up, can I remind you that despite his reliance on the internet for his data, John does have some hard copy of his orchid project, that just a few copies, I think, which anybody who's interested can take away with them. Okay, so we've heard two really fascinating seminars this evening, and could you please join me in thanking John and Sally once again for such brilliant presentations.